The whole village mocked the old woman, but when they found out who her son was, they bitterly regretted it. Nestled among the lush green hills and dense forests, the small village appears like a serene painting, completely detached from the bustling pace of the outside world. Every morning, as the sun just begins to rise, gentle golden rays pierce through the mist that envelops everything. The sound of birds singing echoes from the treetops, blending with the distant sound of a babbling brook, creating a scene that leaves anyone who sets foot here for the first time in awe. However, that beauty is merely a facade for the not-so-easy lives of the people here. In winter, the snow covers everything in white, so cold that it can freeze all hopes. Summer, the scorching sun burns the fields, drying up every precious drop of water. Amid those harsh challenges, the villagers seemed to learn how to rely on each other to survive. But there was one person, for a long time, who chose to live on the fringes of that common life, Mrs. Praskovia. At the edge of the village, hidden behind a winding little road, is her house. That house, just like its owner, carries a somber and old-fashioned appearance. The tiled roof was covered in moss, and the rotten wooden planks of the wall sometimes creaked in the wind. Surrounding the house is a rickety fence, where vines spread wildly, as if nature is trying to shield her quiet existence from the curious eyes of the world. Mrs. Praskovia is an elderly widow, living alone for many years. The memories of her husband and family, if they still exist, are only present in her weary eyes and her weathered face. The villagers rarely see her, and each time she appears, her appearance, bony shoulders, faded clothes, and slow steps, always attracts unfriendly glances. The children in the village often whisper strange stories about her to each other. They called her the Old Witch, and sometimes even threw stones or picked up branches to throw into her yard, then ran away laughing gleefully. The adults were a bit better, but hardly anyone showed any friendliness. They avoid mentioning her in conversations, and when someone asks, they only respond with a look of discomfort or a shake of the head accompanied by biased gossip. Mrs. Praskovia knows all of that. She heard the whispers, she saw the wary glances, and she clearly felt the coldness that everyone directed towards her. However, she never complained or got angry even once. Every time she went out, she would quietly lower her head, avoid people's gazes, and quickly return to her small house. But sometimes, when no one is watching, a fleeting glimpse of sadness appears in her aged eyes and wrinkled face, as if a heavy, gloomy sky were weighing down in her heart. No one knows how long she has lived like that, and no one cares to know. To the villagers, Mrs. Praskovia was just a shadow, something that existed on the fringes of their memories, both familiar and strange. But perhaps it is precisely in that silence that she hides a story no one could ever imagine. One evening, as a thin mist began to envelop the small village, the familiar tranquility was suddenly shattered by the unfamiliar sound of a powerful engine. The sound of wheels grinding on the rugged dirt road, the headlights piercing through the darkness, shining directly onto the houses and fields around. It was a luxurious, shiny black car, something the villagers had never seen in their lives. The appearance of the car quickly attracted attention. Each door opened, each shadow of a villager peeked outside, trying to see clearly the strange thing that had just intruded into their simple world. The murmur began to rise from the houses near the road. Children ran after the car, their eyes wide with curiosity, while the adults stood in groups, pointing and whispering to each other. The car stopped at an unexpected place, right in front of Mrs. Praskovia's gate. The car door swung open, and a tall man stepped out from inside. He wore a neat police uniform, with bright stars on his shoulders, clearly indicating his noble rank. His dignified and cold demeanor immediately silenced the buzzing chatter. The man looked around, his cold gaze sweeping over the gathered townspeople. But instead of stopping to talk or explain the reason for his visit, he turned around and walked straight towards Mrs. Praskovia's gate. In that moment, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. The eyes filled with surprise, mixed with confusion and fear, were directed towards the old woman whom they had always looked down upon. Why would a police general, who clearly does not belong to this poor place, personally come to see her? Could it be that Mrs. Praskovia has done something wrong? Or have the rumors about her all this time actually been true? Whispers began to spread among the groups of people. Some people guessed that she had committed a serious crime and was now paying the price. Others assert that this general definitely has some kind of relationship with her, although no one can explain what that might be. As for Mrs. Praskovia, who had heard the sound of the car and sensed an unusual presence from outside the yard, she still had not stepped outside. But inside the small house, the light from the oil lamp cast through the window crevice, illuminating her silhouette sitting silently. It seemed she had foreseen this moment would come, but her eyes no longer held fear or worry, only a sense of waiting, along with an indescribable sorrow that seemed deeply etched from long ago. The wooden gate creaked as the man gently pushed it open, stepping into the yard. All eyes were on him, filled with excitement and curiosity. In that moment, the small village seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for the answer to the long-hidden secrets. When the tall man in the police uniform stepped into the yard, the atmosphere seemed to freeze. The villagers, gathered outside, watched his every gesture with curious eyes. They saw him gently knock on the wooden door, an action both polite and full of respect, far removed from the authoritative image that the uniform conveyed. The door slowly creaked open, and Mrs. Praskovia appeared. Her gaunt figure appeared under the flickering oil lamp, her austere face unable to hide her surprise, but still maintaining an air of calm. She stood there, looking at the strange man in front of her, her gaze slightly vague as if trying to recall something. The man suddenly stood upright, his hands trembling slightly as he raised them to his forehead, performing a solemn salute. In a warm yet emotional voice he spoke, "Dear mother, I have returned." Mrs. Praskovia stood still, her eyes wide open, looking at the man in front of her, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Time seemed to stand still as she raised her hand, covering her trembling lips. Her eyes, once usually calm, were now filled with intense emotions, a mix of astonishment, deep emotion, and overflowing love. The man took a step forward, bowed his head before her like a dutiful son. He said, his voice choked with emotion, "Mom, I'm sorry for making you endure loneliness and slander all these years. I will never forget your love and sacrifices, Mom. It was you, Mom, who taught me to live strong, to overcome all difficulties, and it was you who helped me achieve today." Those words were like a fire warming the frozen heart of Mrs. Praskovia. She slowly raised her hand, touching his face, bony hands but full of love. Her voice trembled slightly, but it shone with happiness. "It's me? Really is me. Your son has returned." The two embraced each other tightly, as if the distance of the years apart had been erased in that moment. Outside, the villagers stood frozen, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The woman they once despised, whom they called the Old Witch, turned out to be the mother of a noble general, a successful and dutiful son. That truth not only disrupted the villagers' thoughts, but also made them feel ashamed of the malicious rumors and the unfair treatment towards Mrs. Praskovia all these years. But at that moment, she no longer cared about it. In the arms of her beloved son, she felt only a complete happiness, a happiness she had waited for her entire life. Many years ago, Mrs. Praskovia was a strong and determined woman. After her husband passed away in an unexpected accident, the burden of the family fell heavily on her frail shoulders. At that time, her son, her only child, was just a small boy. Despite the pain and despair, she knew that she could not give up. Day after day, she worked tirelessly from morning till night. In the bitterly cold winter, she would wake up before dawn, crossing the snow-covered path to the forest to gather firewood. In the summer, she went to the fields to work as a hired laborer, enduring the scorching sun to earn a few meager coins. The meager meals consisted only of potatoes and wild vegetables, but she always saved the best part for her son, saying she was full even though her stomach was still growling with hunger. Not only did she work hard, but she also devoted all her love and sacrifice to raising her son. She taught her son to read and write, telling him stories about kindness and perseverance. She always encouraged the boy to dream and believe in his abilities, even though their lives at that time were nothing but poverty. As her son grew older, she realized that this small village could not offer him a worthy future. Knowing that it would mean being apart from her son, she still advised him to leave the village to seek new opportunities. The day he left, she didn't shed a single tear in front of her son, only smiled and wished him success. But when your shadow gradually disappeared down the path, she quietly sat by the window all night, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. The months that followed were a series of lonely and difficult days. Without letters or regular news, she could only rely on the faith that her son would be okay and would succeed as she had always hoped. Every day, she still quietly lived and worked, enduring the gossip of the villagers without a single complaint or reproach. She knew that everything she did, all her sacrifices, were for her son to have a better life. Now, when that son has returned in his dignified police uniform, Mrs. Praskovia no longer feels lonely or regretful. The years of hardship, the silent tears, all of it was worth it. For her, her son's success is not only a source of pride, but also a testament to the love and sacrifices she has devoted her entire life to. Throughout the lonely years in this small village, Mrs. Praskovia always maintained a quiet pride, though she never revealed it outwardly. The mockery and disdainful looks from the villagers had never shaken her. She silently endured everything, for in her heart, the greatest happiness was knowing that her son was living a life she had once hoped for. She never told anyone in the village about her son's achievements, nor did she ever boast that the poor boy who grew up in this old house had now become a respected police chief. For her, the gossip and the villagers' disdain meant nothing compared to the pride she felt for the son she had poured all her love into raising. Every evening, sitting by the flickering oil lamp in the small house, she often reminisces about the difficult days that have passed. The memories of the afternoons when she taught her son to write on a piece of old wood, or the times she encouraged him not to give up no matter how harsh life was, always remained vivid in her mind. She didn't need anyone to recognize or praise her sacrifices. She only needed to know that her son had become a good person, someone she could place all her trust and love in. She understands that her sacrifices are not meant to earn admiration from those around her. She does not need sympathy or gratitude from the villagers. The only thing she cared about was that her son had grown up, lived a respectable life, and brought goodness to this world. Therefore, even though she has to face harsh words and ostracism every day, she does not feel unhappy at all. On the contrary, she felt content, for deep in her heart, she knew that everything she had done was not in vain. And now, when her son has returned, standing before her with a demeanor full of filial piety and success, that pride is no longer a silent feeling. It is evident in her eyes, in her gentle smile. Even if the whole village was surprised, gossiping, or regretting how they had treated her, Mrs. Praskovia didn't care. She didn't need their apologies or recognition. For her, her son's return is the answer to everything she has been through, an answer enough to warm her heart for the rest of her life. The truth about Mrs. Praskovia quickly spread throughout the village, like a wave sweeping through the small streets and every rooftop. No one could believe that the old lonely woman, whom they had long shunned and looked down upon, was actually the mother of a respected general. That news not only astonished the villagers, but also made them feel an unprecedented shame. The men who once mocked her, calling her the eccentric old woman, can no longer hold their heads up and look straight at her house. Many people come, bow their heads, and kneel in front of her house, uttering sincere apologies. We were truly wrong. We do not deserve your forgiveness, but please understand that we had no idea. The women in the village, who once whispered and gossiped, who turned their faces away whenever they saw her on the narrow path, now blush with shame. They gathered in front of her house, their eyes lowered, murmuring pleas for forgiveness. Some people brought small gifts, warm loaves of bread, hastily picked wildflowers from the fields, as if to atone for their mistakes. We were too cruel and heartless, a woman choked up, tears streaming down her face. We did not know who you were. We did not understand the pain you had endured. Please forgive our ignorance. Even the children who once threw stones at her house and called her cruel names now stand silently, their eyes full of remorse. A boy stepped forward, placing a small flower in her hand, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I shouldn't have done that. You don't know that she is such a great mother." Before those apologies and sincere remorse, Mrs. Praskovia was neither angry nor accusatory. Her eyes, once accustomed to cold glances and harsh words, now shone with a strange compassion. She smiled gently, her gaze resting on the bowed faces, and spoke in a calm voice. "You don't need to do that. I have never expected anything from anyone in the village, and I do not hold any grudges against you. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to know how to change." Her words made everyone even more emotional. They realized that not only was she a wonderful mother, but Mrs. Praskovia was also a noble woman, rising above all the pain and injustice they had ever caused. From that day on, the villagers' attitude towards her changed completely. They not only respected her because her son was a general, but also for the kindness and dignity she had shown. Those who once shunned her now try to make up for the years of loneliness she had to endure, and the children now affectionately call her Granny Praskovia of the village. Mrs. Praskovia, although she never expected recognition or atonement from the villagers, felt a sense of relief. This change, though belated, is a testament that sometimes kindness and tolerance can awaken hearts that seem to have hardened. Mrs. Praskovia stood still at the gate of her house, her calm gaze sweeping over the people bowing their heads in remorse before her. Her eyes, though marked by the traces of age and years of solitude, contained no resentment or reproach. Instead, it was a look of compassion, as if all the past wounds had drifted away and no longer held any significance. She listened to each apology with an unusual calmness. Each word, each sob, each small gift brought by the villagers, she received with a gentle smile, but did not respond with any reproachful words. When everything was silent, she softly spoke, her voice warm yet profound. "I have lived my whole life in this village, and I understand that you do those things not out of malice, but because you do not understand me. I do not blame you. I also don't need any apologies or gifts. The only thing I need, I already have, to see my son grow up and live a life worth being proud of." Her words moved everyone. A few people tried to offer more apologies, but she gently raised her hand to stop them, her kind smile still lingering on her lips. She didn't want to prolong their embarrassment, nor did she want them to drown in guilt. "This life is very short," she said, her voice small yet clear. "The important thing is not the past, but that you have recognized your mistakes. If we can say one thing, it is to live better, treat each other more kindly. Don't let prejudices or rumors make you hurt others." The villagers were silenced by those words. They did not expect that, after all they had caused, Mrs. Praskovia would not only bear no resentment, but would also show them such profound forgiveness. When the last people left, she stood silently for a moment in front of the house gate. In the fading evening light, her small figure seemed to become even lonelier. But in her heart, a warm fire was burning brightly. It was the pride in her son, the peace of knowing that old wounds had healed. She turned back into the house, closed the old door, leaving behind the apologies, the tears, and the heavy past. For her, those things no longer mattered. The only thing left is the simple joy she found in the love of her family, something that no one can take away. After that day, the small village was no longer the same. The gossip, the cold and distant looks directed at Mrs. Praskovia had completely disappeared. Instead, she became a symbol, not only as the mother of a respected general, but also as an embodiment of resilience and profound compassion. The villagers, who once looked down upon and shunned her, now regard her with a mix of admiration and shame. They couldn't stop talking about her, but this time it wasn't gossip. It was stories about the extraordinary resilience of a woman who had quietly overcome countless hardships to raise her son to be successful. In their eyes, she was no longer a poor widow living on the outskirts of the village, but a symbol of quiet strength, hidden behind her simple exterior. A few days later, Mrs. Praskovia decided to leave the village. The villagers gathered in large numbers to bid her farewell, this time not with disdain or contempt, but with sincere respect. Those who once turned their backs on her presence now bowed their heads in respect as she passed by. With her son, she got into the luxurious black car and left. Before leaving, she turned back to look at the village one last time. Even though the painful memories were still etched in her mind, she felt no resentment. She simply smiled gently, as if to close a chapter of her life, carrying with her the pride and happiness she deserved. As the shadow of the car faded behind the path, the villagers stood there, watching with nostalgia and gratitude. They realized that they had not only lost a neighbor, but also an extraordinary woman who had taught them lessons of tolerance, patience, and the strength of love. The story of Mrs. Praskovia leaves a profound lesson for the entire village and for anyone who hears it. It reminds us that behind the simplicity and humility of a person, there may be extraordinary things that no one can foresee. Superficial judgments and malicious rumors cannot change the fact that love, sacrifice, and patience are the greatest strengths. In the lonely and misunderstood years, Mrs. Praskovia never gave up her belief in the value of family love. It was that very thing that helped her overcome all contempt, ultimately shining as a symbol of quiet strength, an eternal source of inspiration for those who have been tested by life. She has passed away, but her image lives on in the memories of the small village. And from then on, the story of Grandma Praskovia became a reminder for everyone. Live with kindness, believe in the power of love, and always look beyond appearances to see the true value within each person.